This story was submitted by an anonymous viewer. I'm a 23-year-old woman who grew up in small-town Idaho. My story takes place a few years ago. The county fair was a big deal in my area. They would put on big events and shows and bring in some really fun rides and attractions. It was one of the few times we had excitement in our quiet little area. I remember I used to love attending the demolition derby and hypnotist show at the county fair every year. My cousins Jennifer and Kristen would go with me, and this particular year was no exception. We planned to meet up at the fairgrounds at 1 to get good seats for the hypnotist show on a Saturday. We would then have some fun at the fair until the demolition derby that night. I wasn't able to drive yet at the time, so I arranged for my dad to drop me off at the fairgrounds and pick me up later that night. He agreed and dropped me off at the fairgrounds an hour early. I decided to kill time by wandering to an art display. It was in a small bird-like building towards the front of the grounds. So there I was, admiring all the paintings, drawings, and photography that had been submitted, when I started to get this strange feeling like I was being watched. I looked around and noticed a man standing not too far from me. I remember thinking he was dressed strangely for the sunny 90-degree weather we were having. He wore a black hoodie, black denim pants, and black shoes. He also had painful-looking burn-like sores around his lips. I couldn't tell if he was staring at me or not because he had sunglasses on, but he smiled when I looked at him. He just stood there smiling at me until I waved politely and turned to leave. Just as I moved, the man walked towards me. "Hello, my name is Jeremy." He spoke quickly, and his movements were jerky as he reached out to shake my hand. "What's your name?" Getting a weird vibe, but deciding he was harmless, I decided to be nice. "Hello, Jeremy. My name is Chloe," I said with a polite smile. I noticed more burn-like sores on his palm as he reached out to shake my hand, which grossed me out a little. "It's nice to meet you." The man named Jeremy walked away without a word after that. I shrugged off the experience and checked the time. Seeing I was supposed to meet my cousins in about 15 minutes, I decided to go wait in the spot we were supposed to meet. As I left the building, I saw Jeremy standing by the door texting on his phone. I was a bit of an awkward teenager, so I pretended not to notice him as I walked past him and into the grounds. Just a few steps behind me, Jeremy started walking also in the same direction. After a while, I started feeling a bit awkward with him walking so closely behind me, so I decided to stop and let him pass me. I turned to enter a booth selling jewelry and pretended to admire its wares, but Jeremy stopped walking too. He leaned against a food cart not too far from where I was and started texting again. I waited in the jewelry booth for what seemed like 10 minutes and he still hadn't left. I decided to just leave, and just as I left the booth, Jeremy moved again right towards me. "Hello, my name is Jeremy," he said, again, reaching out to shake my hand. "What is your name?" I was so confused. He couldn't have forgotten that he had already introduced himself to me. It was literally 10 minutes ago. I thought maybe he might be joking, so I let out an awkward laugh. "Hello, Jeremy. It's nice to meet you again," I joked. "My name is Chloe." Jeremy seemed to miss my humor and continued talking, taking more interest in me. "Chloe is a pretty name. Are you from around here? How old are you?" Don't judge me for being so dumb. I was from a trusting small community. But I gave him the honest answer to his question, in spite of getting a really weird vibe from this guy. "Thank you," I smiled. "I'm 16, and yeah, I'm from the town just south of here." Just like before, once I answered his questions, Jeremy seemed to catch interest in something else, and he walked away without a word. I checked the time and noticed that I was now running late to meet Kristen and Jennifer. I made the rest of the way to where I was supposed to meet them without interruption. I told my cousins about what had happened while I waited for them, and they also thought it was a little weird. We laughed it off and found our seats. The hypnotist show started, and we enjoyed the beginning, but it wasn't long before I started getting that feeling like I was being watched again. After a quick scan through the audience, I saw something I found disturbing. Jeremy, the guy from earlier, was sitting a few rows behind us. He smiled and waved at me as soon as I recognized him. I noticed he wasn't alone this time, and he was sitting there with 3 other men, all dressed in black hoodies and sunglasses. I decided not to wave back, thinking he might have a crush. I did not want to lead him on. I could tell they were watching us through the whole show. Kristen and Jennifer did too, and it made it really hard for us to enjoy the humorous antics of the hypnotist. We decided to leave the show before it was over and leave the fair for a while, hoping that the creepy men in black hoodies wouldn't be there when we returned. We left for about an hour and a half to get lunch and spend some time at their house. After this time, we decided it might be safe to return to the fair. We walked back, and just as we walked through the gates of the fairgrounds, the same group of men in black hoodies approached us again. Jeremy walked straight up to me and said, "Hello, my name is Jeremy," again, reaching out to shake my hand. "What is your name?" My stomach was in knots. This was just not normal. I did not shake his hand this time, wanting to get away from them quickly. "Hello, Jeremy. My name is Chloe." I said it quickly as I walked past him, still trying to be at least polite. I said nothing more, and we walked into the crowd, not looking back. It would be hours before I would see Jeremy again. We wandered the fair, pretty much without interruption for the remainder of our wait, and we went to watch the demolition derby at around 6 that night. We talked amongst ourselves and decided that if we ran into Jeremy again, my cousin would pick up her phone and pretend I had a phone call from my dad, thus letting him know I wasn't alone even if we got separated. We agreed as the show ended. We still hadn't seen them. We wandered around the games and rode a few rides. It was dark and nearly the time I was supposed to meet my dad. My cousin got a call from my dad on the phone. He instructed me to meet him at a restaurant a short walk away from the fairgrounds in a half an hour, and I agreed. Just as my cousins and I exited our last ride, I was once again approached by Jeremy, alone this time. He walked right up to me and once again reached out for me to shake his hand. "Hello, I'm Jeremy," he said with a smile that split some of the sores around his mouth. "What is your name?" I was really sick of this guy, and I decided to give him fake information this time. "Hello, Jeremy. My name is Hannah," I said, looking to my cousin to cue her to fake the phone call. Jeremy simply shook his head. "It isn't nice to lie, Chloe," he said, before walking away. The 3 of us got chills after that encounter. I told my cousins I was tired and wanted to go home. They agreed and offered to walk with me to meet my dad. They had a curfew of their own, and I didn't want them to be late. And besides, it wasn't a far walk, so I declined their offer. We parted with hugs, and I promised I would call them to confirm that I had made it home safely. I then exited the fairgrounds and walked through the town to meet my dad. Not far away from the grounds, I noticed I wasn't alone. There was a tall man in a black hoodie following me. My heart skipped a beat. I recognized him as one of the men Jeremy had been with earlier. I quickened my pace, pretending not to notice him, and what I saw half a block down the road was even more disturbing. Another one of the 3 men that was with Jeremy was standing by the sidewalk ahead of me. I was getting really alarmed, so I crossed the street and walked on the other side. The 2 men in hoodies kept up my pace from the other side of the street, and I heard one of them make a whistling noise, though neither of them said anything. I was nearing the post office when Jeremy came into my vision, at the end of the sidewalk in front of me. I was really getting scared. What were they doing out here? The place I was supposed to meet my dad was still pretty far away, and I didn't want to be alone on the street with them anymore, so I quickly ducked into the post office. They were about to close, but there was a man and his son just leaving. I explained to them what was going on and asked if I could walk with them. I hoped seeing that I wasn't alone would scare my stalkers into leaving me alone. They agreed, and I walked out with them, but Jeremy and his gang were nowhere to be seen. The friendly people I met at the post office walked me all the way to the restaurant where I met my dad and told him the whole thing. My dad called the police, and I explained again what had happened. The report was filed, but Jeremy and his black hooded friends were never found. This story was submitted by Bill. Let me start off by saying that I'm a male in my mid-20s. I have a wife and a young daughter, and I live in Las Vegas, Nevada. About a year ago, I found myself waking up at odd hours of the night, unable to fall back asleep. It was starting to affect my performance at work, which was at the time working for the U.S. government at Nellis Air Force Base. I went to my doctor, who was convinced that my inability to sleep was due to my stress and anxiety caused by my profession. To my surprise, he started me on antidepressants that same day after a very short appointment, which seemed odd, being that I didn't claim to be depressed or anxious. I figured my doctor knew best and decided to follow through with the prescribed medication, anything to help me get a full night's rest. Not long after taking the antidepressants, my mood started to swing up and down. I wasn't sleeping for days at a time, and I started having brief acute hallucinations and delusions. The adverse reaction to the medication landed me in a psychiatric hospital for 10 days while I stabilized off that terrible drug. My time there was surreal, an experience I will never forget, one that I will think about daily and am sure will stay with me for the rest of my life. After I arrived at the hospital, I was stripped of all personal belongings besides my clothes, aside from my belt and shoestrings, which were seen as possible tools to end one's life. I was then led into the male wing of the hospital, where I saw some of the patients walking into walls, talking to themselves, and drooling as they wandered aimlessly like zombies. I was terrified, but was comforted not long after arriving by my roommate, a kind young man named Scott. Scott had a very welcoming smile. His eyes were bright, and he spoke rather intelligently, at least for someone you encounter at your average loony bin. We discussed politics, played chess with a board and pieces we constructed out of paper, and shared what seemed to be the same sense of humor. Scott told me he was admitted because he had spit on a cop to get off of the street for a few nights. He told me that he had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in high school and required high doses of antipsychotics to remain stable. This would explain why he seemed so normal at the time, being that they line you up to give you meds to ensure that you swallow them. Scott got me through 10 days of shitty group therapies, shitty meals, and dismal living conditions. When my time was up, I gave my phone number, email address, and Facebook information to him, genuinely thinking of him as a good person and a friend I could have for life. That changed shortly after leaving. It had been a week since I was released, and everything seemed back to normal. I retained my job, my family life was on the mend, and I was starting to forget all about my little vacation to the psych ward. That was until I received a text from a strange number. It was Scott. He informed me that he was released after 28 days and was headed to a government-funded assisted living home for psych patients transitioning back into society. I texted him back congratulating him on his freedom and wished him the best of luck. He texted back immediately, telling me that he wanted me to meet up with him. I let him know that unfortunately, with a family and a full-time job, I was too busy to drive to the other side of town to see him on such short notice. This did not please him, but he said he understood and that he would be in touch. I received a Facebook friend request from him within minutes of the phone call, and without any concern, I accepted. What was strange was that Scott didn't have any other friends on his list but myself. But I shrugged it off and decided he may have just created the account and I was his first friend. A week went by, and every day I received multiple messages from Scott, urging me to see him. His messages started making little sense. He started referring to himself as the Son of God, saying that he could change my life if I became his disciple. I responded to one of his messages and asked him if he had stopped taking his medication, and sure enough, he had stopped. He stopped sending me messages after I started ignoring them. About a week later, Scott started posting rants on his Facebook, talking about how he was God and that his wrath should be feared by all. I was still Scott's only friend. Many of these rants seemed to be directed toward me, and I finally regretted giving him my personal information. One night around 2 a.m., I awoke to my dogs barking aggressively. I looked at my phone to check the time, and noticed that I had received a text from Scott only seconds before I awoke. It read, "Hide and seek is over, my friend. Ignoring me was a mistake. By the way, your wife is very pretty. Knock, knock." At that very moment, I heard two very large pounds coming from what sounded like my backyard window. I remembered in horror that my wife had fallen asleep on the living room couch that night, which is directly underneath the window that those bangs were coming from. To my relief, she came bolting into the bedroom and screaming about a hooded man in our backyard. I grabbed my gun and ran downstairs, and there he was, in our yard with a childlike smile on his face and a small kitchen knife in his hand. I told my wife to call 911 and lock the door behind me as I entered the backyard. Scott then looked confused and ashamed as he saw me emerge from inside of my house. He apologized repeatedly and incoherently as I tried to calm him down and stall to allow time for the police to arrive. "Scott, it's going to be okay. You're fine. Please put the knife down," I pleaded. He paused before looking me in the eye and calmly said something like, "I'm a martyr and you're my disciple. This is the beginning. This is the end." Over and over again. Slowly, he started to raise the knife up to eye level while continuously chanting those haunting words. I heard the door open up behind me. It was the police. Before they could get a word out, Scott held the small kitchen knife to his throat and started sawing away at his tender flesh. The blood squirted out immediately like a garden hose. It was truly the most gruesome thing I had ever witnessed firsthand. He didn't get very far before the police got the knife away from him, cuffed him, and immediately started first aid by applying pressure to the wound. Scott survived. His family had him admitted to a long-term mental hospital in Utah, from my understanding. My family and I have a restraining order against Scott, and hope to never see him again. I later found out that Scott was able to figure out where I lived through a Facebook post in which my wife tagged myself and our location as we visited a popular restaurant on the Las Vegas Strip. Scott drove to the location tagged in the post, spotted us, and followed us home with a car he borrowed from his mother, who he was visiting that day. I urge all those who may listen to this story to be more careful of who has your personal information and what you post on social media. Your life may depend on it. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. If you would like to submit your story, all the information you need is in the description. So this video was supposed to be a longer one, as many of you know that follow me on social media, but it turns out that I deleted my audio files after I had already made the video. The video corrupted, which means it screwed up and I had already deleted the audio, so I had to re-record everything. So I do have the other stories. I'm going to re-record those tonight once the traffic cools down. So expect a video pretty early in the morning tomorrow when you wake up. So sorry about that, but yeah, that's what's going on. I hope you all are having an awesome weekend, and if you would like to share your stories, please make sure to include if you would like to remain anonymous or if there's a channel you'd like linked. One of the people in this video actually got lucky. I deleted the file because I actually had it all ready to go with their name, but then they mentioned they didn't want it, so I was able to cut that out real quick. But just so in the future, if you give me your name, if it's in my email, I'm only going to probably do your first name unless you verify you want your name used, just to respect people's privacy. So make sure you write if you'd like to be anonymous, if you want your name used, all that. I really appreciate everyone sharing their stories, and if you'd like to do it, like I said, the links are in the description. Have a great rest of the weekend. I will see you bright and early tomorrow with another video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true.